Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren, und herzlich willkommen zurück. Das ist die 16. Lektion. Das heißt, wir haben die Hälfte von unserer Reise hinter uns. Das ist ausgezeichnet. Also, wir beginnen mit 2 deutschen Superstars. Das, meine Damen und Herren, sind Herbert Grönemeyer und Annemarie Eilfeld. Both are popular German singers, although Herbert Grönemeyer is generally more popular among the 40 and above crowd. Now, the reason we're starting with this pair of superstars is because Ralf und Mia sind große Fans von Herbert Grönemeyer und Annemarie Eilfeld. Ralph, you see, fancies Grönemeyer's music, while Mia prefers Annemarie's. And here's the situation. It turns out that Grönemeyer is coming to München for a Konzert. Remember that die Familie Gruber wohnt in Augsburg, and Augsburg is less than an hour's drive from Munich. Natürlich möchte Ralf nach München ins Konzert gehen. Aber es gibt ein Problem. It just so happens that Mia's favorite performer, Annemarie, is scheduled to play a concert on the very same night, but in Stuttgart. Und Stuttgart liegt 160 Kilometer westlich von Augsburg. Also dann, die Frage ist, was tun? Well, let's invite Ralph and Mia back into the studio and let's listen as they discuss the following dilemma. In welches Konzert sollen wir gehen?
Hallo Schatz. Und, hast du einen schönen Tag gehabt?
Naja, heute Morgen ist der Chef in mein Büro gekommen.
Dein Chef?
Ja, er ist gekommen, weil er eine Überraschung für mich gehabt hat.
Das klingt interessant.
Du weißt, dass ich Herbert Grönemeyer gern habe.
Ja.
Und weißt du, wer dieses Wochenende ein Konzert in München gibt?
Herbert Grönemeyer.
Richtig. Mein Chef hat 2 Tickets für das Konzert, aber er kann selbst nicht hingehen.
Und jetzt hast du die Tickets.
Genau. Ich, Ralf Gruber, habe jetzt 2 Tickets für das Grönemeyer-Konzert.
Verzeihung, meine Damen und Herren, but I need to interrupt our riveting dialogue for just a few moments to point out something hugely important. Well, at least as far as German grammar is concerned. Perhaps you noticed something odd or different about the word order that Ralph and Mia use in some of their utterances. For instance, when Ralph explains why the boss came into his office, he says, ist gekommen, weil eine Überraschung für mich gehabt hat. At another point, Ralph reminds Mia about his affection for Grönemeyer's music by telling her, du weißt, dass ich Herbert Grönemeyer gern habe. Notice that, contrary to all we've learned thus far about German word order, the verbs in Ralph's sentences come at the very end. So far, for instance, we've learned that a verb can occur at the start of a sentence, whether as a main verb, a modal verb, a helping verb, or as the root verb in a sentence with a separable prefix verb. This is how we formulate closed-ended questions. We've also learned that in open-ended questions and in statements, the verb occurs in the second position. Again, whether that verb is the main verb, a modal verb, a helping verb, or the root of a separable prefix verb. But in Ralph's utterances, we see that verbs in German can also occur in sentence final position. To be specific, each of Ralph's statements is actually made up of 2 separate clauses. The clauses du weißt and ist gekommen are what we call independent clauses. And the clauses dass ich Herbert Grönemeyer gern habe and weil eine Überraschung für mich gehabt hat, these are what we call dependent clauses. Now, if we read each clause closely, it should become clear that, in fact, each clause isn't on equal syntactic footing. What I mean is, of the two clauses that make up each utterance, one of the clauses seems to be able to stand on its own, while the other clause seems to need or depend on the other clause to make complete sense. To see what I mean, let's take away the first clause in each of Ralph's two utterances. Now, do you see how it would sound strange to say these two clauses alone? That I like Herbert Grönemeyer, because he had a surprise for me. These clauses can't stand alone because they depend on other clauses within the entire utterance to make contextual sense. This is why we call them dependent or subordinate clauses. And the clauses that they're dependent on, these are called independent or main clauses. Now, main clauses and subordinate clauses are often combined with a special type of conjunction, fittingly called subordinating conjunctions. And two of the most common subordinating conjunctions are weil and das. And as we can see from Ralph's sample sentences, when we use a subordinating conjunction in German, the verb moves to the end. Whether that verb is a main verb, modal verb, an auxiliary verb, or the root verb in a separable prefix infinitive. For example, we can take the following independent clauses and we can make them dependent by prefacing each with the independent clause wir wissen. Next, we need to add a subordinating conjunction to connect these clauses. Here, we'll use the subordinating conjunction das. Then, we need to add a comma between the two clauses. And note that in German, we always have to write a comma. In English, the comma between a main and subordinate clause is optional, but not so in German. A comma must always precede the subordinating conjunction. Also dann, the next thing we do is uncapitalize the subject du in the dependent clause because, well, it's no longer the start of a sentence. And last but not least, we move the verb to the end of the clause. Und das ist alles. That is how it's done. Now, I'll be straight with you. Or as the Germans say, ich rede jetzt Tacheles. There are about a dozen subordinating conjunctions in German, aber keine Panik. We're not going to cover all of them here. Nevertheless, there are three that we should know for right now, and these are weil, das, and wenn. Gut. And now let's get back to the Gruber's dialogue, shall we? Remember that we left them mid-conversation, just when things were about to get dramatic. In fact, I believe we left with Ralph telling Mia,
Genau. Ich, Ralf Gruber, habe jetzt 2 Tickets für das Grönemeyer-Konzert.
Und weißt du, wann das Konzert ist?
Samstagabend.
Ach so, Samstagabend.
Was ist los?
Diesen Samstag ist auch das Konzert von Annemarie.
Echt?
Und weißt du, wo Annemarie ihr Konzert gibt?
Auch in München?
Nein, in Stuttgart.
Ach, Mist.
Tja, was tun?
Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, the stage has now been set for a showdown. Will it be Grönemeyer in München oder Annemarie in Stuttgart? Before we learn the outcome to this cliffhanger, let's focus on a couple of utterances from the Gruber's dialogue. For instance, after Ralph reveals the news about the Grönemeyer tickets, Mia asks him, Weißt du, wann das Konzert ist? And a few lines later, after Mia has announced to Ralph that in fact her favorite singer, Annemarie, is giving a concert on the same night, she says to Ralph, Und weißt du, wo Annemarie ihr Konzert gibt? Both of these utterances are made up of an independent and a dependent clause. And again, in both, the dependent clause is actually a question. More specifically, each clause is what we call an indirect question. And as it turns out, indirect questions in German work just like subordinate clauses. The interrogative pronoun acts just like a subordinating conjunction, which also means that the verb gets pushed to the end of the clause. In fact, any of the following interrogative pronouns, wie, warum, wohin, woher, wann, was, wer, wen, wie viel, wie viele, or ob, any of these interrogative pronouns can also occur at the start of an indirect question clause. And when this happens, meine Damen und Herren, the verb gets moved to the end of that clause. For example, weißt du, warum wir Samstagabend nicht auf die Party gehen? Or with the modal verb, weißt du, wohin wir gehen müssen? Or even with the helping verb when we say something in the present perfect tense. Weißt du, woher sie die Tickets für das Konzert bekommen hat? Alles klar? Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, as of now, we can formulate utterances in the form of an indirect question as well. And as we've just seen, the grammar is basically the same as with subordinated clauses headed up by a subordinating conjunction. Namely, the verb gets moved to the end of the clause. And this, meine Damen und Herren, is what makes German totally, wonderfully, and uniquely German. In fact, in a future lesson, we'll see that indirect questions and subordinating conjunctions, well, these aren't the only things that move the verb to clause final position. So just keep this grammar in mind, please. Schön. Meine Damen und Herren, it is high time that we learn the conclusion of Ralph and Mia's dramatic dilemma. Was machen Sie? Fahren Sie nach München, Grönemeyer zu sehen? Oder fahren Sie nach Stuttgart, Annemarie zu sehen? Let's listen in now and learn how this drama plays out.
Tja, was tun?
Meine Tickets haben nichts gekostet.
Gut, aber ich habe keine Lust, in das Grönemeyer-Konzert zu gehen.
Was kann ich tun, um dich zu überreden?
Ich weiß nicht. Moment mal. Wie ist das Datum am Samstag?
Der 10. Mai. Warum?
Ach so, Annemarie spielt am 17. Mai.
Prima. Dann können wir dieses Wochenende ins Grönemeyer-Konzert gehen.
Richtig, aber nächsten Samstag, also am 17. Mai, da gehen wir ins Annemarie-Konzert.
Abgemacht.
Well, well, meine Damen und Herren, in the words of Shakespeare, Ende gut, alles gut. But even more important than the harmonious ending to their dilemma, Ralph and Mia's conversation also gives us more insight into the great and wondrous German grammar puzzle. For instance, when Mia admits to Ralph, ich habe keine Lust, in ein Grönemeyer-Konzert zu gehen. Now, similar to the biclausal utterances we looked at earlier in our lesson, this utterance from Mia also comprises two clauses. The independent main clause here is ich habe keine Lust, and the dependent clause is in ein Grönemeyer-Konzert zu gehen. But the dependent clause here contains neither a subordinating conjunction nor an interrogative pronoun. Instead, it has what we call a zu infinitive, zu gehen. Now, dependent clauses like this, with zu infinitives, are called infinitive clauses. And just like with all dependent clauses in German, the verb in an infinitive clause, which is always the zu infinitive, this verb also gets moved to the end of the clause. Ich habe keine Lust, in ein Grönemeyer-Konzert zu gehen. Interestingly, in my experience teaching German over the years, native speakers of English actually have a pretty good intuitive sense of when to use a dependent zu clause. It's probably because they're so common in English as well, and because both languages share the same kinds of main clauses that set up infinitive clauses with these zu infinitives. Consider, for instance, the question, have you ever thought about writing a novel? Now, how would you respond to this question in English, using one of the following phrases? Well, for each of these phrases, the correct response in English would be to use the infinitive clause to write, followed by the noun phrase, a novel, as in, I don't have time to write a novel. I don't intend to write a novel. It's really difficult to write a novel, and I'm trying to write a novel. Well, guess what? In German, there are main clauses just like these. And just like the English main clauses, the German ones are commonly followed by an infinitive clause as well. Although, as we've seen, in German the word order is somewhat different. Namely, the zu infinitive comes at the end. So the German versions of these English utterances would be: Ich habe keine Zeit, einen Roman zu schreiben. Ich habe nicht vor, einen Roman zu schreiben. Es ist schwer, einen Roman zu schreiben. And ich versuche, einen Roman zu schreiben. First, note that Germans usually include a comma to separate the main and dependent clauses. Second, you'll notice that within the infinitive clause, the same word order rules apply that we've learned for subordinate and indirect question clauses. Namely, the verb comes at the end. What's more, we can also include even more information in our infinitive clause while keeping this same word order. For instance, we might say, I don't intend to write a novel alone in Paris this fall. Because, who writes a novel alone in Paris in the fall? Everyone knows you're supposed to write novels alone in Paris in the summer, am I right? Anyway, in German, this utterance would go, Ich habe nicht vor, einen Roman diesen Herbst allein in Paris zu schreiben. One interesting thing I should point out is that there is no subject in an infinitive clause. Unlike subordinate clauses and indirect question clauses, the subject in an infinitive clause always carries over from the main clause. It works the same in English. So, for example, in the sentence, you never have time to watch an entire movie. The subject here from the main clause, which is you, that subject automatically carries over into the infinitive clause. It's you who never watches an entire movie because you don't have enough time. Get it? Well, it works the same auf Deutsch. Du hast nie Zeit, einen ganzen Film zu sehen. The subject, du, automatically applies forward into the infinitive clause. Alles klar? By the way, German grammar does a pretty cool thing with separable prefix verbs when these occur in infinitive clauses. It actually puts the zu particle between the prefix and the root verb. For example, the German version of I always have time to call my mother comes out as Ich habe immer Zeit, meine Mutter anzurufen. Remember that the verb for to call is the separable prefix anrufen. And in Ich rufe meine Mutter oft an. And in case you're wondering, ja, natürlich. Ich habe immer Zeit, meine Mutter anzurufen. I call her like 2 or 3 times a week. Anyway, here's one more example. The German translation for a sentence like, it's hard to get up every day at 5 a.m., ain't that right, would be, es ist schwer, jeden Tag 5 Uhr aufzustehen. The zu gets squeezed in there between the prefix auf and the root verb stehen. Pretty cool, huh? Now, as for other elements that we can include with an infinitive clause, these are things like the where, when, how, or the recipient of the action. Well, German grammar does prefer a certain order. If there's a direct object, it often comes first, followed by the elements of time, manner, and place, or TMP for short. For example, du hast nie Zeit, einen Film abends allein zu Hause zu sehen. Here, I should also mention that in colloquial German, speakers tend to put the direct object right next to the zu infinitive, like this. Du hast nie Zeit, abends allein zu Hause einen Film zu sehen. Und das ist alles. Meine Damen und Herren, the following is a shorthand guide to how German syntax works for all dependent infinitive clauses. Direct object, TMP, zu clause, or TMP, direct object, zu clause. Alles klar und wunderbar? By the way, this same word order applies to main clauses as well. Well, with the exception of the verb, of course, which, you'll remember, is in the second position. For instance, we might say the following about our never-to-be-written novel in Paris. Ich schreibe keinen Roman diesen Herbst allein in Paris. Or, in a more colloquial fashion, we might say, ich schreibe diesen Herbst allein in Paris keinen Roman. Also remember that speakers of German often prefer to put the time element at the head of an utterance, in which case we would say, diesen Herbst schreibe ich allein in Paris keinen Roman. You see, German word order is really straightforward, in the sense that it's nicely rule-governed. And if you're a grammar nerd like me, then you might even find it fun to spend a lovely Friday evening piecing together long utterances in German. Moment mal, ich habe noch eine Idee. Let's do one together, shall we? You know, piece together a long utterance in German, one with both a main and infinitive clause, and using the elements that we just covered. Ja? Möchten Sie das machen? Prima! Also dann, we'll start with the following main clause. Es ist keine gute Idee. And then here are the elements that we'll include in the infinitive clause that comes after this main clause. Only they're out of order. Zu trinken, im Bett, eine Tasse Kaffee, halb wach, mitternachts. By the way, halb wach means half awake, and mitternachts means at midnight. Alrighty then, let's assemble our lovely infinitive clause. First comes the direct object, eine Tasse Kaffee, followed by the TMP. Remember, that's time, manner, and place. Mitternachts, halb wach, im Bett. And finally, we put in the zu infinitive, zu trinken. And just like that, meine Damen und Herren, we have a gorgeously complete utterance. Es ist keine gute Idee, eine Tasse Kaffee mitternachts halb wach im Bett zu trinken. Or, if we were being more colloquial, we would place the direct object, eine Tasse Kaffee, right before the zu infinitive itself. Es ist keine gute Idee, mitternachts halb wach im Bett eine Tasse Kaffee zu trinken. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, in this, our 16. Lektion, we managed to once again cover a lot of ground in our journey. And while our ultimate goal still lies many lessons away, make no mistake, that goal is getting closer and closer. Looking to our next lesson, for instance, we're going to learn some more frequently used infinitive clauses. And then, meine Damen und Herren, brace yourselves, then we are going to learn another grammatical case. Wie bitte? Oh, you want to know which grammatical case I'm talking about? Na ja, wenn Sie das herausfinden wollen, müssen Sie dabei bleiben. Pretty sneaky, right? Also dann, auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich.